everyone, and welcome to week 8 of this year's Bitesize session. If you can hear me, could someone just give me a quick thumbs up? Yay, thanks, Steve. Great stuff. And a special welcome to Hazem Zohny, who is going to be our speaker today. Some of you might remember Hazem from his previous session on collective minds, which was back in 2022, I think. Hazem is a research fellow in Oxford. He splits his time between us here in the Uehiro Centre and the Department of Psychiatry. And today he's going to be talking to us about the ethics of government economic policy. So Hazem, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Great. So thanks for that intro, Liz. I'm gonna jump right in here. So I take it that you all come across these sorts of sacrificial dilemmas that ethicists love to talk about. Right, so this is the trolley problem that we all know and love. Would you pull the lever to save 4 people but kill 1 person? Now, people have different intuitions about this, but a common criticism of these kinds of thought experiments is that they're fairly divorced, or they seem fairly divorced from real-world decisions because the world doesn't sort of work like a trolley problem. It's a lot more complicated. But I want to suggest that, in fact, because of those complications, and specifically because of the complex and interconnected nature of economic and social activity, you can expect most big government policy decisions to include some major sacrificial decisions built into them, and indeed kind of often hidden from view. So while we don't explicitly think about those decisions in this way, every time there is, for instance, a new government budget, decisions will have been made that, in effect, hugely influence, for example, how many people die prematurely in the short term versus the long term, and more generally, how quality of life and well-being are distributed to whom and when. And that is because every decision to allocate resources in one area typically means that those same resources can't be used elsewhere at the same time. This includes government decisions to borrow more money, for instance, deficit spending, that is government spending that exceeds its revenue. That carries an opportunity cost. About £100 billion were spent last year just on debt interest, which is around the same amount the government spent on education that year. So that interest being paid on debt could have been spent to reduce, say, child poverty or improve hospital services, potentially saving thousands of lives. But beyond debt, these sorts of sacrificial decisions amount to sort of much more concrete things, like choosing to invest, say, in a £1 billion cutting-edge medical center that could have been used to save, or rather, investing in a cutting-edge medical research center that could save millions of lives in the future, but not using that same amount to provide, say, immediate life-saving treatments to thousands of patients right now. Which do you choose? Save potentially, it's uncertain, millions of lives in some future, or thousands of patients right now? Or deciding, say, to upgrade infrastructure to prevent future disasters. That might mean diverting funds from, say, current mental health services, potentially leading to an increase in suicides this year. Is that worth it? And I could go on allocating resources to improve education in underprivileged areas. That could dramatically enhance life prospects for tens of thousands of children, but that might come at the cost of reduced elderly care, affecting quality of life and survival rates for thousands of senior citizens. These aren't just sort of abstract fiscal choices. They're decisions about whose lives are prioritized over others, or whose suffering is addressed first, and ultimately what kind of future is being built at the expense of the present needs of particular individuals and groups, which is to say, every budget line implicitly answers the question, whose urgent needs are we choosing not to meet in order to address some particular issue. Now, this may all seem very obvious, and politicians do love to talk about tough choices, but you wouldn't know what those choices actually amounted to, given how we typically talk about these decisions in terms of abstractions like economic growth or economic stability, sustainable development, fiscal responsibility, and so on. I want to suggest that these terms, obviously useful shorthand for complex economic concepts, but they can also obscure the kind of, I want to say, mind-boggling ethical trade-offs inherent in big policy decisions. Now, of course, one reason we don't talk in these terms is that we may well not know what the actual trade-offs of a given policy actually are. And maybe retrospectively, we get some insight, but even then, maybe not. But to start us off, I'd like to use a hypothetical policy to kind of pump our intuitions a bit about the sorts of difficult ethical decisions I'm referring to that kind of lurk beneath major policy decisions. So suppose you're a policymaker and you're debating whether to enact this policy A, right? So policy A says, for every 100 lives it saves, it causes significant mental health issues in 5,000 other people. Now, this isn't an overtly economic policy, though, as we've all learned going through the pandemic, major health policies clearly have huge economic implications. And there's been this huge debate on whether, for instance, COVID lockdowns were justified given their impact on people's mental health, amongst other things. But to be clear, these figures here, or this ratio here, I mean, that is hypothetical. It's not meant to mirror what the actual ratio was in terms of the consequences of lockdowns on saving lives versus contributing to mental health issues. Those figures, as you can imagine, are still kind of being uncovered and remain very much so contested. So I'm just trying to use these figures as a hypothetical stepping stone, if you will, to get us to think about the kind of implicit value judgments and moral assumptions that policies may be making, even if we aren't necessarily aware of them at the time. And so I want you to consider not so much whether you would endorse policy A, but how you might start to think about it. Now, some people have very strong deontological views that would sort of always favor saving lives when you can, and that knowingly letting someone die when you can avoid it should be impermissible. I think most people, including myself, most people have some fuzzy threshold in that while we may be very, very uncomfortable choosing to let one person die to save, say, two, at some point, if letting one person die means saving 5 or 50 or 5,000 or 5 billion, or certainly 5 billion, at some point, most people will not be absolutist about it and will choose to sort of let the smaller number die in order to save the larger number. And as we'll see with economic and fiscal policies, even though such policies aren't explicitly framed that way, they do involve foreseeably letting thousands of people die prematurely every year because of how societies prioritize limited resources. But we'll get into that. For now, consider, how do you feel about this hypothetical ratio of saving 100 lives but causing significant mental health issues in 5,000? What about sort of 10,000 people suffering mental health issues, or 10 million or 7 billion? Keep in mind that, of course, significant health issues, those can lead to suicide, they can lead to unemployment, broader significant economic impacts, which themselves could lead to many more deaths downstream. But imagine if you're willing to play along with this hypothetical, you really want a bit more specificity here before you engage with this kind of uncomfortable analysis. So you might wonder things like, who are those 100 people being saved? How old are they? What kind of significant mental health issues are we talking about? If it's depression, how deep and lasting a depression are we talking about, for instance? So let's complicate policy A bit, and let's consider policy A plus. So for every 100 lives this policy saves, it's among those who are over 70, and it causes significant mental health issues in 5,000 teenagers. Again, this is a hypothetical, and while it might look like it's starting to mirror some of the COVID pandemic kind of retrospective arithmetic, these numbers, as I've said, are only designed to sort of bring out and get us to consider these potential tensions inherent in these inherent to these trade-offs, rather than imply that this was sort of the actual calculus in the pandemic. But yeah, so I mean, does this added framing in terms of age make things any different? I think some people, I mean, some people might think people over 40 when compared to people over 70 rather, when compared to teenagers, you know, they've had a good go at life in some sense. Teenagers, in contrast, have their whole lives ahead of them. So this might change their intuitions a bit compared to the initial policy A. It might make the trade-off seem perhaps less worthwhile than it had been for individuals if they were all in the same age group, for instance. But notice we're making all sorts of assumptions now about how we weigh quantity of life, number of years lived versus quality of life, which includes, amongst other things, not having significant mental health issues. Some of us will have this vague intuition, as I said, that yes, of course, all lives are valuable, but if we have to choose who to leave worse off, we may prioritize the younger over the older. In various circumstances, you may even find yourself asking, if I were 70 and someone said, we can save you, but it'll come at the cost of giving depression to 5,000 teenagers. It's an uncomfortable thought, and I'm not pretending I have a view on it, but what I'm even more uncomfortable about is the possibility that we might be making these sorts of trade-offs implicitly while kind of brushing the difficulty in the decisions under the carpet by failing to openly discuss or acknowledge these types of sort of profound assumptions underlying these decisions. You might also find yourself trying to balance short versus long-term effects. So thousands more teenagers getting depressed, say, than otherwise would have gotten depressed, that may negatively impact their grades, which might affect whether they go to university or which university they go to. And that might affect the kinds of jobs they get. In fact, it might affect which jobs are created. And that could have all sorts of long-term downstream implications economically, which in turn could shorten the lives of many thousands of people over the years. On the other hand, when people we know and love die, even if they are over 70, we grieve for them, and that grief can be a form of depression. And some percentage of grieving people will not be able to shed that depressive grief for months or years. And in some small number of cases, those grief-induced depressions may even lead to suicide or really be devastating and hard to treat. And that has also downstream economic implications as well. And if that's starting to sound complicated, well, it's the tip of the iceberg, because in reality, there is rarely ever any certainty about the outcome of a given policy, right? So policy A plus has so far been presented in a way that is completely divorced from the sort of predictive powers of our epidemiological and economic models. So let's consider this slightly more realistic policy framing, policy A plus plus. This says there's a 65% chance that for every 60 to 100 lives it saves, among those over 70, it causes significant mental health issues in 2,000 to 10,000 teenagers. Okay, well, I'm personally so bad at thinking about probabilities, I couldn't even tell you if this seems like a better or worse trade-off. But there's now this 35% chance of no negative effect at all. How do we weigh this uncertainty in our decision-making process? On the other hand, both the number of lives saved, 60 to 100, and teenagers affected, 2,000 to 10,000, these are ranges, and that variability adds another layer of complexity, right? Are we prepared for the worst case scenario of only saving 60 lives and affecting 10,000 teenagers? Or should we base our decisions on average outcomes? I want to suggest the answer isn't immediately obvious. But actually, what I really want to emphasize here is that in reality, nearly any model that is used to create these sorts of projections is very likely to be highly contested, including by top experts in the relevant fields. So critics will frequently challenge, the data collection methods, the applicability of the data from different contexts, right? So why are you using data from one country or even one city or community and applying it to predict outcomes in different countries or cities or communities? And just more generally, the reliability of predictions for complex social and economic systems. In fact, some probability figures might be little more than educated guesses due to a lack of directly relevant data. So there's this uncertainty that adds yet another layer of complexity to an already difficult policy decision, which is all to say, these sorts of policy trade-offs, even if we had the foresight to uncover them, are typically riddled with just deep, deep uncertainty. So not only are we being asked to make these tenuous comparisons between quality and quantity of life, the old and the young, the short term and the long term, but we also have to make these comparisons while deeply uncertain about what the actual outcomes might be. Crucially, how we navigate, how we decide to navigate uncertainty itself is riddled with ethical assumptions about how to deal with the unknown, right? So how much potential harm are we willing to risk for a possible benefit? How do you weigh uncertain future benefits against more immediate known costs? And how often should we reassess and adjust policies as new information emerges? I could keep going. How many resources should be dedicated to this reassessment process? Is it £5 million a year, or 5 billion, or 50 billion? Now, keep in mind, I haven't even discussed opportunity costs, like what other policy options we could have deployed that would not be compatible with deploying policy A. Are there other supplementary policies we could use to reduce the mental health impacts? And if there are, well, what are the trade-offs entailed by those further policies? And none of this even touches on deeper trade-offs that might be linked, for instance, with autonomy and paternalism. There's an underlying question behind all this related to how much a government or a policymaker should intervene in people's lives for their own good. And it turns out people disagree about this as well, or at least people don't have clear intuitions about this as well. So the trite conclusion of this kind of thought experiment is that, well, the world is complicated, but it's also a very uncomfortable conclusion, because these kinds of seemingly impossible trade-offs and uncertainties pervade virtually all major policy decisions. And yet, public discourse typically will fail to capture that complexity. Instead, policies are usually discussed in simplified terms, like I said, economic growth, stability, public health, fiscal responsibility. And that reductionist approach can obscure that complex web of sacrificial dilemmas, uncertain outcomes, and competing values that are at play. And some might say, from a basic democratic perspective, that actually leaves citizens woefully uninformed about what's truly at stake in policy decisions. And so what I want to do now is to look at a couple of sort of closer to real world examples to further draw those points out. So let's look at austerity. I'm going to talk a bit faster because I'm sort of suddenly conscious that there's not that much time left. So let's step back here and try to make a charitable, or at least kind of a non-cynical take on the case for austerity at the time, which was primarily rooted in concerns about fiscal sustainability and economic stability following the 2008 financial crisis, right? So proponents, they argued that we got rising national debt, budget deficit that posed significant risks to the country's economic future, and they contended that without decisive action to reduce government spending, the UK might face these sorts of costs that you can see here. And so the advocates were saying something like, we need fiscal responsibility to restore confidence in markets, and that would lead to increased investment and job creation and long-term economic stability. And so the motto was very much so that short-term gain was necessary to secure long-term gain and prevent a more severe economic crisis in the future. On the other hand, critics pointed out to the significant social and economic costs associated with the reduced government spending, right? So that included increased mortality rates, particularly amongst vulnerable populations, rising poverty and income inequality, slower economic recovery, long-term damage to public services. And so the anti-austerity voices basically said these policies may have been counterproductive. And potentially cause even more economic harm than they prevented. So I want to sort of look at this from the dimension of how austerity may have impacted mortality rates. There's far from a consensus here. The estimates of excess deaths attributed to it vary widely. They range from 50,000 to 330,000. And those studies typically compare mortality rates during austerity periods to projected mortality rates based on pre-austerity trends, and they try to use various statistical models to account for various influencing factors. Crucially, those studies don't tell us how people would have, or they don't tell us how many people would have died under a different set of policies, like say a policy of increased government spending in the face of rising debt. It's possible, which is to say it's compatible with the results of these studies, that just as many or even more people could have prematurely died, largely regardless of how the government responded. And that might be because economic crises like the 2008 financial crisis, these often have downstream, far-reaching, long-term consequences that can impact public health and well-being through various indirect channels, right? The reality is we don't have any models that can strongly confirm or disprove the likelihood of these alternate histories. And you can be sure that the studies I've mentioned on death that can be excess deaths that can be attributed to austerity are themselves contestable. But it is hard to imagine some alternative that does not involve some fairly uncomfortable trade-offs, even if those trade-offs may well have been overall better. But let's use this sort of let's use austerity and its impact specifically on mortality to ask some difficult questions, specifically on how we should balance immediate health and well-being needs against long-term fiscal responsibility. So consider this kind of scenario. Current healthcare spending, let's just assume, at the time had allowed for timely or relatively more timely treatments and preventive care and emergency services. Now, austerity did not, for the most part, directly lead to cuts in healthcare, but it did involve stopping an increase in funding to keep up with rising costs and demand, and also cuts to social care did increase pressure on healthcare. But let's say the proposed budget cuts would lead to longer wait times for non-emergency procedures, reduced funding for preventive care programs, potential closure of local health facilities. And let's say we had these studies that suggested the cuts could result in an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 premature deaths annually due to delayed treatments and reduced access to care. Now let's consider the other side of the equation, right? So the long-term fiscal considerations, and let's say current spending trajectories, not current at the time, suggested that national debt would double in the next 20 years. If this occurs, projections indicated interest payments would consume 25% of the national budget by 2045. This would likely necessitate much deeper cuts to all public services, including healthcare, would slow economic growth and further reduce the resources available. And let's say the models suggest in this scenario that this could lead to 20,000 to 30,000 premature deaths annually by 2050 due to severely underfunded public services and economic hardship. I want to be careful here to emphasize that real-world policy decisions are rarely as binary as cut healthcare spending now or face fiscal crisis later. There's always a spectrum of possible actions, each with its own set of consequences. So the goal here is not to present a forced choice between two extreme outcomes, but to kind of try and explore the complex moral landscape hiding behind these sorts of evaluations that are part of a larger policymaking decision process. So when we discuss these trade-offs, it's easy to fall back on seemingly objective terms like confidence in projections or what we owe future generations. But let's unpack what these kind of really mean in moral terms, right? So confidence in projections. When we say we're confident in a projection, that suggests that, say, cutting or not increasing healthcare spending now will prevent worse outcomes later. What we're really saying is something like, amongst many other things, I'm willing to accept a certain number of premature deaths now because I believe it will prevent an even larger number in the future. as comfortable as a moral decision as that might be, it's also riddled with a deeper moral question, like, well, how confident is confident enough? So consider, if we're 90% sure that cuts now will prevent 20,000 annual deaths in 2050, does that justify does that justify 5,000 extra annual deaths now for a few years? And what if that was more like 70% sure or 50% sure? At what point does the uncertainty make the trade-off unacceptable, assuming it was acceptable even at 100%? Obviously, we typically sort of lack clear intuitions about these probabilities, and that shouldn't surprise us, right? We see this very clearly in our own lives. Most of us would unhesitatingly risk our life to say, at least to some degree, to save, say, a drowning child. Yet we rarely lose sleep over not donating money that could save multiple lives, say, in a developing country. And that's because our moral intuitions seem to kind of short circuit in various ways when faced with these sort of abstract probabilities and distant lives. Consider similarly intergenerational justice. I want to suggest this isn't just about abstract notions of fairness, it's about weighing the moral value of current lives against future ones. I suspect most of us think it is right to impose some hardship on current generations to benefit future ones, but we don't really have a clear idea on, well, just how much hardship. Is it the loss of 10 pounds a year per living person kind of hardship, or is it 1,000, or is it 10,000? Moreover, if we believe technological progress will make future generations better off anyway, how much should that impact our thinking here? And how do we even begin to account for the kind of the compounding effect of our choices over time? So perhaps it's not surprising that we don't talk about things in these terms, because aside from it just being mind-boggling, there's really no universal intuitive agreement on how to weigh present versus future well-being once you really get into the nitty-gritty. Same thing for the distribution of impacts. When we talk about distribution, we're really asking, whose lives are we prioritizing? Is it morally justified to impose greater hardship on certain groups, for instance, the elderly or low-income families, for the potential benefit of others? Again, how much hardship exactly? And how do we weigh a policy that might save more lives overall, but disproportionately harms vulnerable populations? Again, I want to suggest that these buried questions force us to kind of confront our beliefs about equality, fairness, and social responsibility. And it does so in a way where, if we're merely speaking in terms of fiscal responsibility, we don't really get to that. And lastly, on this, I want to talk about moral risk, right? So consider, if we want to maintain current spending and a fiscal crisis occurs due to, say, a war or some supply chain breakdown, are we, in some sense, morally culpable for these resulting deaths? Another way to frame this is, how many people prematurely dying, say, over a five-year period would be worth it in order to minimize the impact of a fiscal crisis that could potentially lead to 10,000, 100,000, or 1 million premature deaths? Similarly, if we cut spending and the projected crisis doesn't materialize, are we sort of responsible for the unnecessary suffering? How do we think about that? How do we weigh known immediate harms against potential larger future harms? Again, the question of premature deaths is far from the only consideration. Well-being is this complex, multifaceted thing that goes way beyond how long people live, and it infuses things like the jobs we have, the commutes we take, the richness of our social lives. And so we can imagine things get all the more complicated once we start comparing not just premature deaths now versus some possible future, but the well-being of people in all its dimensions now versus some possible futures. Okay, well, on this point of the future, I want to move very quickly to look at climate change policies before I wrap up. And to consider some uncomfortable trade-offs involved on that front. So consider the 2023 autumn fiscal statement by the then Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, and specifically its framing on green investments. And amongst many other things, the statement boasted these new oil and gas licenses, but it also promised to invest $1 billion over the following 7 years for a new green industries growth accelerator. And on the face of it, that seems kind of contradictory approach to climate change and economic growth. New oil gas licenses are approved, and yet sort of more spending on green industries. So let's use this to formulate a broader kind of policy trade-off, and let's call it policy B. Policy B potentially that could potentially accelerate change in the short term to fund green technologies that might mitigate it in the long term. And let's frame it a bit more concretely, right? On the one hand, you have increased carbon emissions over the next 5 to 10 years, potentially leading to more severe weather events and associated deaths. On the other hand, faster development of green technologies that could prevent millions of climate-related deaths over the next 50 to 100 years. Now, this kind of framing raises a bunch of questions, right? How do you weigh short-term harm against potential long-term benefits, again, but also how much weight should we give to the possibility that the green technologies will fail to materialize or will turn out to be less effective than hoped? And how many present lives are we willing to risk for the possibility of saving future lives? Now, this last question also has a unique dimension to it that didn't come up before when discussing austerity, and this is the non-identity problem. So the non-identity problem is this philosophical puzzle that concerns the moral evaluation of actions that affect future individual whose very existence depends on those actions being taken, right? And that really comes to the fore when thinking about climate change policy. So consider, different economic conditions due to a policy on climate change that leads to different job markets. Changed job markets affect where people live and work. That alters who meets whom, falls in love, and has children. And the specific children born in each scenario, depending on whether that policy is adopted or not, would be different. So policy B doesn't just affect future people. It, in a sense, determines which specific individuals will actually come to exist in the future. And that leads to the seemingly paradoxical question. If the people born as a result of policy B have lives that are broadly worth living, and they wouldn't have existed without this policy, how can we say we've harmed them by choosing this policy? Let me complicate, I'm conscious of time, but very quickly, let me complicate policy B a little more to bring out this issue. So policy B plus, you implement economic strategies that may increase the near-term carbon emissions and potentially leading to more severe climate impacts for current generations, but that fundamentally alter the trajectory of technological and social development. This new trajectory would result in a different set of future individuals coming into existence. That is, a future population distinct from the one that would exist under more restrictive climate policies. What I want to suggest is that this framing brings to the forefront a set of fairly difficult ethical questions. And one of them is, if the individuals who come into existence as a result of policy B wouldn't have existed otherwise, right? Can we be said to have harmed them, even if they face climate-related challenges, but assuming they consider their lives to still be worth living? Conversely, if we choose a more restrictive climate policy, are we in any sense harming the potential individuals who now won't come into existence as a result? Now, these sorts of questions get us into very muddy terrain and population ethics that would require a number of hours to untangle. But I'm hoping to have sort of very quickly conveyed here that even what we mean by concepts like harm, benefit, and obligation in the context of future generations is actually a deep kind of philosophical rabbit hole that, if we went into right now, we might not come back out. And in any case, it's not, in case this isn't clear, I'm not at all suggesting that this should be some argument for a nonchalant attitude to climate change. I'm trying to highlight that our intuitive notions of intergenerational justice may need significant refinement to deal with the reality of such policies, in the sense that that such policies don't just affect future people, they affect which future people will exist at all. And that puts pressure on what we mean by harm and benefit in this context. So yeah, I mean, I had a little wrap up here that would take a couple of minutes. Liz, is it best to just sort of stop here, or should I go for another 2 minutes?
Well, we've been running over time every week so far, so go for it. And if anyone has to drop out, please do, and hopefully we'll carry on in the Slack channel. We've already had a question about whether you could supply some further reading, Hazem, so maybe we could
I have
use that as an opportunity. Perfect.
The last slide as well. Yeah.
Great. Nice.
So what I've tried to suggest here is that we often frame policy decisions in economic terms, right? Growth rates, fiscal responsibility, market stability. These concepts are no doubt useful. They're proxies in many ways for human welfare. However, I'm hoping we can also see how this kind of economic and fiscal language can obscure the ethical dimensions and huge sacrificial dilemmas at the heart of big policies. So when we speak of managing inflation, we're implicitly discussing whose purchasing power we're willing to affect. When we talk about acceptable levels of unemployment, we're making judgments, value judgments about whose jobs we consider more or less essential. And it turns out once you scratch below the surface, there are a whole bunch of fairly uncomfortable and controversial trade-offs to consider. And so the challenge, might be in bridging this gap and kind of trying to develop a framework that allows us to move much more fluently between economic indicators and their ethical assumptions and implications at a very fine-grained level. Of course, you could argue, that sounds like a terrible idea, because the moment politicians or policymakers start speaking in terms of deeply uncertain sacrificial dilemmas over a long-term or a long time scale, we may well find ourselves just gripped by complete analysis paralysis, right? Who's to say how confident a government with low public trust should be in order for it to decide to sacrifice X number of lives or X number of livelihoods now to improve some other number of lives later. You could say, are we better off just sort of fudging it and hoping for the best, given how complicated it is? That's clearly sort of the general approach so far, right? But I want to suggest this kind of fudging it and hoping for the best is that what we're essentially saying is that citizens aren't really capable of grappling with the real ethical implications and uncertainties of the policies that govern their lives. And you can see how, this would create a disconnect between electorate and the true nature of political decisions. And you can see how this would undermine the very principles of informed consent and representations that democracies are supposed to be built on. And it's a bit like telling a patient, well, dear patient, if you really knew the truth about, the uncertainty of the outcome of the surgery being successful, you'd probably freak out, so we best not discuss it at all. And that seems like, that doesn't seem like a justified approach. So I'll leave it there, and here are some suggested readings. And yeah, thank you very much for tuning in.